I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight. So just so everyone's aware, we are going to record this session so that we can post it to the school council website and also share it with our participating schools. So just so you know that we are recording. Tonight we are going to do the third of our Indigenous Learning Series. And so we have Julia returning from the Canadian Roots Exchange. And Julia, I'm sure, is going to do a little introduction of herself, but just so you know, she is a recent U of T grad. And among many other things, she did study Indigenous studies while she was there. And that is how she got into this work with CRE. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you tonight, Julia. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. So this workshop is titled Wampum Education. I'm so sorry for the date. That is very obviously wrong. This was from the last time that I did this, which was actually with a group of high school students, which was really fun. But I promise that you'll also really enjoy it, or at least I hope that you will. It's really nice to see like returning faces. Yeah. So before we get started, here's some digital housekeeping stuff. You can change your name on Zoom. If you hover over your video, you'll see 3 little dots, and rename should be an option. You can also add your pronouns if you're comfortable with that. I really encourage using the chat function while we do this workshop. I love engaging in the chats, and I'll keep an eye on it throughout this workshop. You can raise your hand or clap to talk if there's something that you want to say at any point, but I also welcome interrupting. Microphone and video muting is at the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen. And we do have subtitles for today. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a little button with 2 C's on it, and that should offer you captioning. They're not the best, but they're there, and I hope that they're helpful. I invite you to prepare yourself and your space in being present today. So this could look like removing distractions like your phone, but again, your roommates, your family, your pets are not distractions in any way, and they're welcomed in this space. Not all of us have like a private place in our house to do these things, and that's completely okay. You might want to get a beverage or note-taking stuff, and just a reminder to center yourself throughout this workshop. We could get into some potentially triggering things, and I just want to remind you that it's completely okay to step away from this workshop if you feel like you need to, or if something else comes up, if you need to go to the bathroom, you can do that. That's no problem at all. And before we start, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. So I have a complicated relationship with this country, as I'm sure many of us do. But the original stewards of this land, specifically the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit, have resisted the Canadian government's best efforts to completely colonize where we stand. This acknowledgement is specific to Toronto, a land that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum and the Tuura Wampum, which I'll talk about more thoroughly throughout this workshop. And in light of the 215 children found at a residential school in Kamloops, I'd like to take a moment to honor the resilience, power, and strength of not only those who survived Canada's ongoing genocide against Indigenous people, but those who did not. This is important to my work because I choose lateral love every time and try to remove as many power structures in my work as possible. I encourage you to take a moment to think about the land that we're currently on, and I'll pause here. Okay, thank you, everybody. So here is our agenda for today. We'll start with some introductions, go into an agreement activity, I'll share with you some of the teachings behind wampum belts. We'll have a break if we have time for it, and then we'll get into some questions and discussion. So this is a positioning statement. If you were at the last workshop that I did, you've already heard this, but I will do it for anyone if they're new here. So my name is Julia, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm currently residing in Toronto or Toronto. And I was born and raised in Brampton, Ontario. I'm mixed Filipino and Italian descent. I'm a settler in Treaty 14 territory. Some identities I carry are that I'm 22 years old. Actually, my birthday just passed. I'm 23 and I haven't added this, but I'm 23 now. I carry some invisible disabilities. I'm a second generation migrant. I am bisexual and child free. I'm also a light-skinned person of color in the lower middle class who is employed and a survivor. And I do have the privilege of having a post-secondary degree in women and gender studies, diasporic and transnationalism studies, and Indigenous studies. Some roles that I hold in community are friend, daughter, cousin, sibling, accomplice, auntie, artist, poet, and educator. And I'll introduce a bit about Canadian Roots Exchange, which is the organization that I work for. So CRE is a registered charity that provides Indigenous-based leadership, learning, and reconciliation experiences to every youth that participates in our programs. A few years ago, I was one of these youth that participated in our programs. And we do three main types of activities, including leadership training programs, workshops, and gatherings. Yeah, if I'll drop the link to our website in the chat, if you want to check out more of the stuff that we do. And now that I have introduced a lot about myself, I'd love to hear from everyone who's in the room. Normally I do this with everyone kind of speaking out loud, but I think with this size of crowd and with the amount of time we have, we should probably just do it in the chat. So if you'd like, you can introduce yourself with your names, your pronouns if you're comfortable, where you're from, and your favorite fruit. For the record, my favorite fruit is mangoes. So as we continue with this workshop, you can kind of scroll through the chat and get to know a bit about the rest of the people in this workshop. But we'll get started with our group agreements. So these are kind of guidelines for how this group is going to interact with each other while we're in this space. The first one is to actively listen, which I know is really hard, especially when you've been staring at a computer screen for the last 8 hours, and now here I am asking you to do it for another hour. But I think active listening looks like a lot of different things. And sometimes just having this on in the background, kind of retaining some of the information is completely okay. Another one is alone we know less, together we know more. I'm not an expert on any of these things. As a non-Indigenous person, I've been told some of these teachings, but again, I'm not an expert. I do have permission to share them by the knowledge keepers, but I'm no expert. And I hope that you learn some things from me, and I know that I will learn things from you all. Another one is to question the idea, not the person. Try not to make judgments or assumptions about who a person is. One mic, one voice, which again is hard in a Zoom place, but interruptions are completely fine. Confidentiality, so stories stay and lessons leave. If someone shares a personal story, I ask that you just keep that memory. That's not something that needs to be shared, but the lessons that you learn from this workshop, I would love for you to share with other people. Consent is another one. So I'm never going to ask you to share information that you don't want to share. I'm never going to ask you to turn your video on when you don't want your video on. That's completely up to you. Double checking pronouns. So if someone has put their pronouns into their Zoom name, make sure you double check that before you refer to someone. and approach your edges. So if you listen up, if you listen lots, try to speak up. And if you speak a lot, try to listen. Does everyone feel comfy with these group guidelines? Does anyone want to take something away, talk about something, add something? Give us a minute to think about it. Okay, I'm going to take silence as a no. But again, this is a living document. So if I ever feel like we should come back to these group agreements, or if someone thinks that we should come back to them, talk about them some more, we can do that at any point throughout this workshop. And we can always add to it or take stuff away if it doesn't suit our needs. So the workshop that we'll be doing today is Wampum education. I'll tell you a bit of history around wampums, share with you some of their teachings, and we'll talk about why they're so important and how we can respect them, uphold their power in our everyday lives. And we'll look at some of the reasons why they're not being respected right now too. So has anyone heard of wampum before, or like know what they are? A bit, yeah. You will most often hear them in land acknowledgements, especially if we're in Toronto, because the 2-row wampum and the district 1-spoon wampum govern this land. And so in a lot of land acknowledgements, they'll often say this. I know the TDSB says it. I'm pretty sure it goes over the announcements. Maybe. I don't actually, don't quote me on that. I don't know. But we'll start off with an agreement activity. So you're going to go out into breakout rooms and you'll have 10 minutes to look for an image or a GIF that represents some sort of agreement. And I have some rules for this. So no contracts or handshaking. Those are too easy. Those are too simple. And I know that you're all a lot more creative than that and can find different things. Some questions that you might want to ask yourself are, what are the different types of agreements that we make? And what is it about an interaction that makes it an agreement? And then another question would be, what is the difference between a good agreement or a bad agreement? So keep the link to the image or the GIF that you find. And once we come back to the main room, we'll talk about some of them and why they're agreements. So hold on while I set up this breakout room. Okay. So I've opened up all the rooms. Feel free to go there. I'll send some messages in the chat. And yeah, see you in 10 minutes. So I just asked that you put the link to the image or the GIF that you found in the chat, and we'll go through some of them. I'll start sharing my screen again. Okay, so I don't think that we'll have time to go through all of them because I do want to get into like the real conversations, the bigger conversations, but we'll go through a couple of them. So this one is from Stephanie. Yeah. Does anyone from Stephanie's group or Stephanie want to talk about why this is an agreement?
In my group was Carrie Ann and Nisha. I hope I'm saying your name right, Nisha. Nisha, it was her idea about a potluck. Did you want to speak to it? Or
yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think we had a bit of a discussion about different ideas, but this one was the first one that came to my mind, and just the idea of that everyone kind of has a role, and there's this sort of shared understanding that you would bring something to share, but there's not necessarily rules around what you would bring, and it would be kind of up to people on what they would bring and everyone has kind of different interpretations of whatever meal it is or whatever shared food they would bring. And then yeah, there's sort of an understanding of everything's to share, but there's also, if someone didn't bring something, it's not like they wouldn't be included in a potluck. So there's sort of, you know, unwritten, I guess, rules, if you will, around the understanding of a potluck and how it works and different things that, yeah, different parts that each person plays.
Yeah, I love this example, and I think it brings up the point that we each bring something to agreements. We each have an understanding, we each have our own interpretations of an agreement, and that will bring a piece of ourselves to that agreement. I'll go to another one. Okay, so this looks like the scale of laws. I'm sorry, I don't know the actual term for this. And this was from Kelly. I think if anyone from Kelly's group or Kelly wants to talk about why this is an agreement.
So Grace and Colton and I worked together. Actually, Colton shared the first one we talked about just above mine as it was the thumbs up. So maybe Colton, do you want to talk to that?
Sure. And sorry, this is the iPad my son uses. So my name's actually Adrian. I just didn't want to change it and have it left for a kindergartner because he won't know how to change his name tomorrow. So for the thumbs up, we were trying to think of hopefully, in theory, if an agreement is balanced, different ways you might express that you've come to an agreement, and thumbs up, or our other member mentioned like a hug, those kind of signaling that you have a meeting of the minds, and hopefully, you know, all parties are happy with whatever the agreement is. And so that's why we had the thumbs up, which kind of leads into the scale of how agreements could be balanced or not balanced, depending on the power going into the agreements and whether or not it's a good agreement.
What? That's what.
Yeah, great. And I love when people bring up the example of a thumbs up. That's a really common one that I get, because a thumbs up is maybe not universal, but many of us understand a thumbs up as an agreement. And that's like a gesture. It's not something that's written. It's not something that's spoken. But when you see a thumbs up, you know what it means. You know that it means okay. And I think this speaks to the fact that agreements don't always have to be written, that there's lots of types of nonverbal agreements that we make every single day. We'll do one more. Okay. Sarah's. I don't know if I've clicked this link before. No, I haven't. Okay.
Oh, you have to scroll down. It's just to the gathering right there.
Okay.
Yeah. Just we talked about just having discussions and hearing all sides of a discussion, and someone mentioned that for example, telling your kids they have to go to bed. Well, that's not an agreement, because you're just kind of ordering them to go to bed. Whereas if you agree on I don't know, going to bed after you read a story or something like that, it's just where both parties kind of had made the decision and had their say, their opinions voiced, and where you kind of just, it's really difficult. Sorry, I'm having difficulty without just saying agreeing.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm just I think where you have a discussion about both sides, and yeah, you just have a mutual understanding.
Mm-hmm. I think for all types of agreement, discussion is such an important part of it, because when we talk about an agreement, that's how we build trust. That's how we make sure that the other person understands how we think of the agreement and that we understand where the other person is coming from as well. And I like this image of a circle because the circle teachings that I've gotten and the reason why we do these workshops when we're in person, we always sit in a circle, is because you can see everyone while you're in the circle, and that you're all on like the same playing field. Versus if you think about a classroom, all of the students are facing the teacher. The teacher is typically standing. Sometimes teachers will sit, but it's a much different physical representation of a relationship. So I'll go back to these slides. Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. I wish that we could go through all of them, but I do want to get further into this. Okay, so wampum belts are a type of agreement, similar to a contract in which there's different communities coming to the table to agree to something, but different than a contract because they're a much more visual representation of the agreement. The term wampum is an Algonquin word that means white beads on a string. Wampum are traditionally made from white beads and purple beads. The white beads are made from whelk shells, which you can see here. And the purple beads are made from quahog shells, which you can see here. The white beads are representative of peace, power, and goodness, while the purple beads represent the opposite, which is like hostility, disagreement, sorrow, and sometimes death. And the reason for these two shells being used is that in the ocean, whelk shells overpower and eat quahog. And this relationship represents aspirations for peace, always overcoming hostility in wampum belts. So amongst Eastern woodland indigenous communities, so think Haudenosaunee, think Anishinaabe, think Algonquin, living on Turtle Island, wampum serves a variety of purposes, including diplomatic and ceremonial purposes. So an example I like to use is picture a person going from one community to another. Typically, they would wear a wampum belt either around their shoulders or around their body in some way to represent that they are under this wampum belt. To show that they're a message carrier, to show that they come in peace. And many communities have wampum keepers who keep the original belts and who continuously interpret their histories because they are living documents. You know, they change as we change, and their understandings of them are constantly changing as well. So here you'll see a picture of a wampum belt being beaded. I know that it takes 4 to 7 hours for each bead to be made. And that's not even considering the time that it takes to weave the actual belts. And I think that that speaks to the importantness, the sacredness of these belts, and that they're not just something that should be taken lightly. Does anyone have any questions before I move on?
Yeah, I do. And you may get to this, but so when the wampums were made with the European settlers, with like the French or the English or the Dutch, maybe, was there, do you think, an adequate understanding from the European side, like what they were and what they were agreeing to, or was it just a pretty belt to them? Like
So I get this question a lot, and truthfully, I don't have an answer, but I think that there's a lot of things that we can take into consideration. So like language is a big one. And yeah, I think this is a really hard question to answer, and I don't know, but I think the messages from these wampum belts are continuously being taught, like what we're doing here today. So whether or not they were fully understood at the time of their creation, I don't know. I think that we can move on from that. Yeah,
Like
I'm not a history expert, but
like all treaties, right? Like
mhm,
they, you know, the indigenous peoples didn't understand the English contracts they were signing the same way that maybe the settlers didn't understand what they were receiving and the value of it.
yeah, I definitely think that that's something that you have to take into consideration when you're thinking about when these were made. Yeah, hard question. And I also think that we might never know the answer to that, which is unfortunate, but we move on. So I'll talk a bit to you about the Tura Wampum, which is this belt here. This is one of the oldest treaty relationships between Indigenous people on Turtle Island and white European settlers. It was made in 1613, which I think is 408 years ago. A student told me that and I didn't double check. I just trusted them. But it was made a really long time ago. And this agreement was made between Dutch colonizers and the Haudenosaunee. So the Dutch had initially proposed a paternal relationship where the Dutch would be the father and the Haudenosaunee would be the children, which you can see in this little clip art that I have here, like a very parental relationship. And what are some of the things that happen in a parent and child dynamic? It sounds like one of the groups already kind of talked about it with like the going to bed example. If you like tell your child to go to bed, that's much more of an order. But I think that there's a lot of things that happen in parent-child relationships. What are those things? How would you describe it?
There are power struggles and both the child trying to exert power and the parents trying to exert power, and they struggle with that.
Definitely. I think the parent-child relationship is inherently a power dynamic. And that doesn't make it a bad thing and that doesn't make it a good thing. It's just the nature of the relationship. And that's okay. It's okay to have some control over a child. But what's not okay is when two peers act in a parent and child relationship, or in this context, two communities, because that doesn't really make sense. In a parent and child relationship, the child is growing, it's learning, they're becoming a grown-up. So it makes sense for there to be a power dynamic, but between two communities, does it really make sense? That's the question I'm asking. I don't really think so. Ingrid says, I think or hope that the parent is always trying to do what's best for the child and would put the child's best interests ahead of hers or his. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. There's also like aspects of love, of like familial love between parents and children. Of course, there's going to be tons of examples where that's, yeah, in a healthy relationship, yes. And we know that parent-child relationships are not always the healthiest. But whether they're healthy or whether they're unhealthy, there is still always a power dynamic. And I think that's the point, that the Haudenosaunee were like, hey, no, that's not the relationship I want. Sarah says, I recall from the Indigenous Canada course through the University of Alberta that the two Wampum also symbolize the understanding that two cultures would exist in parallel but separate. There would be non-interference. Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to get more into what the two Wampum belt actually represents. So the Dutch fully rejected this idea. Here, I'll switch back to the image of the two-row. And proposed a relationship that was not father and child, but more like siblings, peers, or kind of like friends, which is a much different relationship. When I was growing up, I definitely expected my mom to tell me when to go to bed, but did I expect a friend to tell me? No. And would I have listened to a friend to tell me? No. this belt represents the river of life, and the two purple lines represent the two paths of a Dutch and a Haudenosaunee boat. So the Dutch ship represents the Dutch peoples and their customs, and the Haudenosaunee would be a birch bark canoe that represents the Haudenosaunee peoples and their customs. They travel down the river together, parallel to one another, and they don't interfere with each other's customs or ways of being. And another important aspect of this is that they won't try to steer the vessel of another. They won't try to steer the boat of another community. So between the purple rows are 3 rows of white beads that represent the Great Law. The Great Law is the Haudenosaunee belief system. And there are 3 main principles. The first one is peace. The second one is strength through unity or friendship. And the third one is good mind and equal justice or trust. So that's the 2-row wampum belt. This is a very complex wampum belt. And what I just shared with you was a really quick summary of what this is. But I think that we can see a lot of examples of how this wampum belt is not being respected. The most recent example, and I think the most common example that I get is residential schools, and which were a very clear example of the Canadian government trying to steer the vessel of Indigenous peoples, of trying to tell Indigenous peoples how to live their lives, which resulted in a lot of violence. And the act itself was incredibly violent. Does anyone else have any other examples?
I think there are lots of examples throughout. Like I dance. I'm a contemporary dancer as well as a teacher, and I did a piece with Barbara Diablo, who's Mohawk from Gananoque, and it was illegal to dance in Canada for Indigenous people between 1817 and 1953. So there's an example of appropriating, well, not allowing people's cultures. But there are so many laws that we had in place. Another friend of mine said that, his grandfather, if he went into town, if he went off to reserve, if there were 3 men found in town, 3 Indigenous men talking, they could be arrested for conspiracy against the Canadian government. And again, that law was in place up until the 1970s. So there are so many examples of how this wampum belt hasn't been honored since Europeans have been settling in Canada. So the 60s scoop, for example, there's, still today, there are many, many living examples of how the governments and settlers are not honoring the wampum belts and the agreement that we could live side by side in peace and caring for the land and caring for each other. That just hasn't happened for hundreds of years.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you bring up a lot of really good examples of larger structures so we see the Canadian government doing this a lot. And all of the examples that were shared in the chat are really good examples of this, of corporations doing this, of municipal, provincial, and federal governments all enacting this kind of idea of steering another's boat. But I also want to ask you to think of how you do this in your personal life. One of the ways could be like tone policing. So that means when an Indigenous, in this case, or a marginalized person speaks about their experience in a way that makes you uncomfortable, and you react to them with like gaslighting or like asking for proof, or even saying, you can talk about this in a more peaceful way. That's all tone policing. And, we don't have a right to tell someone how they should express how they feel about something. But yeah, these were all great examples. Does anyone else have any last comments before we move on to the dish with one spoon wampum? Okay. So this is an image of the dish with one spoon wampum belt. Again, I wish we were in person because CRE does have replicas of these, and it's amazing to see and feel the weight of them because they're quite heavy. They're made of a bunch of different shells, and it's very obvious the care and intention that was put into them. But before I tell you about this wampum belt, we'll do another short activity. That's a survival activity. So I want you to imagine that everyone in this Zoom session is transported to a remote area. So we're all picked up and dropped off in the middle of the forest somewhere. What is one item that you would need for survival? And you can put this in the chat or you can unmute and tell me. Shoshana says water, Donna says water, or Dana, so sorry. Valerie says a knife or blade of some kind, something to purify water, warm coat, matches. Yeah, so you're all hitting points of survival that we all really need. So like warmth for one is definitely something, water, definitely. Matches, I'm assuming the knife was for like hunting, maybe chopping wood. But yeah, these are all things that we need to survive. But as a singular person, we can't survive on just one item. Like Brent, you're not going to be able to survive with just matches. I'm so sorry to tell you that, but you won't. Even water is just one part of all the things that we need to survive. Usually when we do this activity, I have a bowl of Play-Doh, and I ask that participants take a chunk of Play-Doh and mold something and then share why they need to survive with it. And typically towards the end of this circle, we'll run out of Play-Doh, which is really fun because I get to tell the other participants that I'm so sorry you didn't get to survive this activity. We can't really do that over a Zoom place, but I hope that the message still resonates. So now we're thinking about resources and survival and all the different things that each of us needs to survive. Let's talk about the dish with one spoon wampum. It's a peace treaty that was made between the League of Five Nations and the nations allied to it, and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe. After a lot of war was taking place. So there were a lot of different Indigenous communities that were fighting over resources, over land, and their way to solve this was the dish with one spoon wampum. It covers a really vast territory, which includes all of the Great Lakes region, which means Ontario, New York State, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I like to bring this up because it's important for us to recognize that Indigenous communities do not think of the borders that we have in place, and that things like the dish with one spoon covenant exist outside of those borders, and that I am a person who lives under the dish with one spoon covenant, and someone who lives in Wisconsin is also a person who lives under this covenant. The treaty was commemorated into this wampum belt that consists of a white background and a symbol of a spoon within a rounded dish at the center of the belt. So I know that this doesn't exactly scream a bowl with a spoon in it, but this is what it is. Can you all see my cursor? Yeah, okay. So this purple outline would be the bowl, and this white stripe would be the spoon. I've heard that a spoon is specific to this, and not like a fork or a knife or anything, because with spoons you don't puncture something. So it's a anti-violent sentiment. So this belt was made between European settlers and, this belt was made between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and then extended to European settlers once they arrived. It's also talked about that this wampum belt has been extended to all newcomers and not just those European settlers. Although I know that that conversation is still happening, and it's kind of a debate right now. But even though I'm not a European settler, I do still choose to live under this. It is the oldest peace treaty between settlers and Indigenous folks. So it was the first treaty that was made. The guiding principles of this belt are that we take only what we need, that we never leave the dish empty, and that we always leave something in the dish for everyone else, and that we keep the dish clean. So knowing what these guiding principles are, what do we think the dish represents? Think a round object that has resources for us that we want to keep clean.
Mother Earth.
The earth, yes. So the bowl represents the earth. And I think one of the most important parts of this treaty is that this is not an agreement that is just between people, that this is an agreement that we have with the land as well, that the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe made with the land, and then extended it to settlers. And that the land is an equal partner in this agreement. So the first guiding principle is that we take only what we need. How do we think that that guiding principle isn't being respected or thought of currently? Capitalism, yeah. That's a word that definitely holds all of this within it. I think that capitalism is directly against the principles of the dish with one spoon wampum. We can see this a lot with like over farming, overfishing, really any industry, because we're creating so much that we don't actually need. The next principle,
Creating all the pollution with it too.
Yeah, and the pollution, which is the third one, keeping the dish clean. Why is it important that we keep our earth clean?
So that it's always around and it's able to provide for those, like there's always something left in the dish, right? It's the other one, right? There's always something left for the rest of the people that come after us.
Yeah. So if we never leave the dish empty, there will always be something left for someone else. And that includes all of the people that will come after us. I was an assistant to an elder for about a year and a bit, and we went on a medicine walk to gather some medicines for ceremonies that she was holding, and I was mostly just there holding all of her bags, so she didn't have to hold them while she walked. But one of the first things she said to me is that when you go to pick medicines, you never ever pick from the first plant, because you want to make sure that there is another plant growing, and you want to make sure that when you pick, that there is still something growing so that the next person who needs this medicine can come and grab some. And I remember as like a little first year student, that completely blew my mind. And then she went on to say, we're also not going to take from the second or the third, because I want to make sure that there's a bunch here. And that's something I carry with me through a lot of my life, and I think can be applied to a lot of different situations and not just going to pick medicines. So this wampum belt, although it has been, or like the common conception is that it has been extended to every person who lives in the region that it governs. Something I bring up a lot with the kids that do this workshop, and that I would ask you to think about how your kids think, is when I was growing up, I knew what was illegal and what was legal in the Canadian context. And I'm sure that a lot of your kids will know that it's illegal to steal, and that that's something that they should not do. But I wonder, do they know about these covenants, about these wampum belts? Because truthfully, they're the same in the way that they're guidelines for how we should live our life, and that they govern us specifically on a region. So like Canadian laws govern us because we live within Canada. So these wampum belts are also something that govern us because we live on Turtle Island and we live within the Great Lakes region that the Dish with One Spoon wampum belt covers. And that is the most important part of this workshop, is to consider why kids grow up knowing what is legal and what is illegal in Canada, but don't know about these things. And that's a very intentional process. It's very much on purpose that we don't know about these wampum belts, and that a lot of us are learning about this for the first time. It took me until university to learn any of these words. And yeah, does anyone have any questions?
I don't have a question, but just an observation. Isn't it sort of insane that almost all of the Canadian legal rules, like don't steal, don't kill someone, and don't harm people's children, and don't, like all these things, these rules that of course our kids know about because they come up in conversation, but that all of those rules have been broken by the Canadian government when they got here, when it became. Sorry, I'm rambling. Just that idea really blows my mind.
No, that's okay. I love rambling. I ramble all the time. And I think that's a really important part, because the Canadian government's actions are always ironic in the way that they portray themselves. And like I used to be very happy to be Canadian. Like as a migrant, I used to be very proud and like very intense about my pro-Canada stance. But after learning all this, I think it gives a lot of context into the country that we live in. Yeah. So I have some closing kind of thoughts before we go into like a question time. And then if you do need to leave, you can totally do that. So wampum belts are not aspirational documents. I know that when you hear about them and when you hear about their guiding principles, it seems like, oh, if we lived in this world, that would be nice. But it seems unrealistic, but they are realistic because people live this way for years and years. They have just been ignored and misunderstood for far too long. And coming to a workshop like this, learning about them, thinking about how you can enact their guiding principles in your everyday life is the way that you bring power back to them and the way that you fight for Indigenous sovereignty. Wampum belts are not only grounded in physical life, they're sacred agreements that bind people to each other, that bind people with the land. And they're built on a philosophy that assumes goodness in the world. So a lot of laws kind of assume bad things, assume that humans will do bad things, but wampum belts assume that we are trying to do good, that we want to do good, and that good will come from us respecting these wampum belts. So with that being said, we can go into some questions. And we kind of already did this reflection question, but if you have an answer or want to talk more about how these agreements are not being respected, please feel free to do so.
I guess I'm personally kind of blown away by the moral authority that these wampum belts, like, it kind of seem to inherently have, unlike like Canadian law, which, like, we, you know, the government has the moral authority to dictate that you shall not kill someone. But like you said, this is about like assuming the goodness of people, and it just seems like it has more strength and more power when it, speaking of morality, because it is caring and not about, you know, what thou shalt not do, but what thou shalt do, right? Just seems more powerful and beautiful.
I think the things with these wampum belts that really get to me are that you can see how corporations could enact them and how corporations don't. But you can also see how yourself as an individual can bring respect to them. Because I feel like a lot of laws are either individual or it's a corporation, and that, you know, I could never imagine doing something that a corporation would do. But these wampum belts, I can see myself in all of them, and I can see my Indigenous peers in all of them. Grace asked, can you talk more about how it is so intentional that we don't learn about them? Yeah. Okay, so I think the intentional not learning about them stems from a lot of different problems. So firstly, one of the things that you learn about with like Canadian laws is you learn about them from your parents, and you learn about them from the people around you, and you learn about them at school. So if parents don't know this information, we can't expect that their children will. And schools don't teach this information, as they focus a lot on like Canadian history and the ways in which Canada came to be. And that is an intentional process because Canada lives in direct contradiction to a lot of these principles. So the example of capitalism being against the principles of the dish with one spoon wampum belt because it doesn't care for the earth is a great example. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so Canada is a capitalist country. So acknowledging and teaching the dish with one spoon wampum as a valid form of governance directly contradicts how Canada is made and how Canada's economy runs. So it's intentional that we don't know that we live under this covenant. Sarah says it's so much tied to white supremacy and privilege. This is just the way it is attitude that is built on entitlement. For sure. I'm very used to having these conversations with like kids in grade 6. So it never gets to this level of intense, but I'm happy to have this conversation. Yes, these are all very much tied to white supremacy, as white supremacy is tied to colonization, as colonization is tied to capitalism. These are all systems that play with each other, and that can't exist without the other ones. Did that answer your question, Grace? Okay, great. Yeah, and I think that these wampum belts are something that kids really understand, because the sentiment behind them is about goodness, is about what we can do. And that's why I think kids take a lot from this workshop, but I'm so happy to have done it with adults who can kind of reflect back on their understandings of governance and their understandings of agreements, and think about what are we actually agreeing to when we live in Canada.
Can I just add, I put a quote in there that I learned at a freedom school thing, and I just want to make sure I explain myself. I put something that I learned from that workshop, which was that the reason we don't know about our history a lot, and by our history, I mean the Indigenous history, is because those in power tell the story. So our history has been told by white people who were in power. So they didn't include, sorry, my daughter's singing in the other room. So we didn't include, you know, the Indigenous history didn't get in there because that's not who was in power at the time.
Definitely. And I think, you know, it's a really huge cliche, but knowledge is power is incredibly important for us to understand when we think about this. Because if I had known these things when I was learning about Canadian laws, I would have started to question colonization. I would have started to question why these things are happening much sooner. Tanisha, thank you for coming and thank you for letting me know. Colonization was all about cancel culture. Do you want to explain that more, Valerie? I don't know exactly what you mean.
So, I mean, there's lots of complaints right now about like statues that don't deserve to be standing anymore, and history that we're finally learning about or is coming to light now, and people are all mad because it seems like cancel culture, but it just goes back to the same old, like the history is written by the winners or whoever presumes to be the winner, and it doesn't make it all the whole history. It just makes the history that's being told. So like history, what has been written and what we've been taught has just been canceling out the cultures that have existed before. I mean, obviously was an attempted genocide to completely cancel cultures on Turtle Island, but yeah, colonization, the whole intent, the entire purpose of colonization was to cancel culture and to make people forget they ever were. Didn't work.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts about cancel culture, and like as a millennial / Gen Z, I have a lot of thoughts about it. But yeah, everything you said was true. Everything you said. Megan also put that kids can compare wampum to friendship bracelets, which I love. That is so cute. Kids are really cute in this workshop. When I do the survival activity, I get a lot of hearts because people want love to survive. They want their friends and family around them, which I think is so cute and pure because I would have never thought to do that. Any kids books? Yes, so I'm gonna put a link to this bookstore. It's called Strong Nations. It's an Indigenous owned bookstore that sells all types of Indigenous curriculum, even for personal reading. They have a lot of stuff. I know they do have a kids section, so they probably do. Yeah. Does anyone have any last questions, final thoughts? No? Okay. Yes, Sarah with the simplicity of the one dish, one spoon. Yes, that was one of the first wampum belts that I learned about. And I think it's incredibly simple to understand, but also incredibly hard to enact as an individual. So just a final miigwech, salamat, and thank you for coming to this workshop, for sitting with me, for talking about these things. It was truly a pleasure. And also the last one was also truly a pleasure. I love coming. It's really refreshing for me to talk to adults for a bit. I'll just stop sharing my screen. And yeah, I hope you all have a great night.
All right. I just want to say thank you, Julia. You are wonderful. You've shared a lot of knowledge with us tonight, and we really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot, and my mind was blown a little bit. And I hope everyone else's was too. Thank you, everyone, for coming.